morning, everyone. I was kind of hoping that they would leave the Blessed Mother here. It would add some dignity to my presentation. Some of you are with us at Napa in the summer. I gave a keynote then on the idea of virtues as superhabits. Available on YouTube if you want to watch it later on. This, in a sense, is a bit of a follow-on for that. In that presentation, I talked about kind of what virtues are and why they're important. Today, I want to get into the sort of practical, the how. Because I think as Catholics, sometimes we forget the importance of virtue. We think of virtue generically, and we forget that the individual virtues are the way in which we live the Christian life, and that when we grow in a particular virtue, when we act in a certain virtue, we are actually acting with Christ because they are His virtues, and that we kind of share in collectively as the body of Christ. So, but before kind of diving in, I want to talk a little bit about some problems, some very practical problems that we face as a society and that businesses face in particular, and how virtue can help solve these problems. So the first one I want to talk about is the decline in labor productivity growth. So 1990 to 2007, 2008, we had pretty healthy growth in labor productivity. After 2008, we have yet to recover. The rate dropped to almost half what it was. And why this matters is when we have higher labor productivity, we can pay people more. And just all kinds of good flows from that. It's harder to raise a family when you're not paid very well. Right? So labor productivity is really at the heart of a lot of very important things, and we have this endemic, seems, problem with its growth. The second problem is perceptions of corporate ethics, perceptions of how ethical businesses are. So this is from a very recent poll by Gallup and Bentley University, asking people how important they thought it was that businesses be ethical, and then how ethical they judge businesses to be. So the first question, how ethical are businesses? Should businesses be ethical? 98% of respondents said yes, they should. It's a little odd. I wonder who those 2% are. It's like, yes, cheat me and lie to me. Like, I don't quite get that, but let's just say that almost everybody thinks it's a good idea for businesses to be ethical. Yes, okay. But then the second question asked was, are most businesses ethical? Only 39% of people agreed with that, either strongly or somewhat agreed. And the question wasn't even saying, are all businesses, it just are saying most. Now, I think that people tend to underestimate how ethical businesses are. I think we can also blame Hollywood for a lot of that. Different story for another day. But the fact remains that generally people, more than a majority of people think that businesses aren't very ethical. And why this matters is when people think that businesses aren't very ethical, there's more enthusiasm for government regulation to, quote, make us ethical, right? So that's also a problem. I think we're experiencing that right now. And then the third problem I want to highlight is the division and political polarization in this country, and particularly among people as customers or consumers of businesses and the businesses' products. This is from that same Gallup study. The first one asking people whether companies should take a stance on political issues. 53% of people who vote Democrat say yes, 22% of people who vote Republican say yes. That companies should promote DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. 75% of Democrats say yes, they should. 20% of Republicans say that they should. And the only one where they seem to agree is if a company endorses a politician of an opposing party, I would be less likely to buy from that company. So both Democrats and Republicans agree on that statement. The problem, of course, is that they're talking about opposing parties, so you're not satisfying either of them if you do that. I analyzed this data and wrote about it in a recent piece for Forbes a couple of weeks ago, and the point I was making in that article is that companies should be very wary about making any kind of political statement, because it's just all kinds of trouble, because you're going to offend a big chunk of your customers no matter what you do. But for the purposes of this talk, I just want to highlight this great division, right? Very deep division, and the data goes on a whole bunch of positions that people consider to be important, just have very different and opposing ideas. Virtue, I want to suggest, helps us with all three of these. The ethics one is sort of obvious. If people were more virtuous, then hopefully the perceptions of how ethical they were would go up. I think virtue also helps with reduced division, brings people together more. But the third one you might be scratching your heads about is, how does virtue help with productivity? And it's in a couple of ways. But to understand that, we have to understand what we mean by virtue. Even well-formed people, I find, speaking all over the country and around the world, people think of virtue as just sort of another word for morality. So be virtuous, be moral, be good. Be a virtuous business leader means be a moral business leader. It's that, but it's not just that. So we have to go back to the traditional understanding of virtue as a habit of excellence, a habit of success, a habit that kind of brings out the very best of what it means to be a human being. And in so many cases, these habits, these virtues are really like superpowers, which is why I came up with the term superhabit, because I want to bring people's mind to the fact that a virtue is not just this sort of good, kind of generic goodness, but it's a very specific thing. So courage, for example, the virtue of courage is the superhabit of moving forward even though you might be afraid. And it can be developed by anybody. Generosity is the superhabit of being giving freely. It can be developed by anybody. Too often, I think, we think of these things as characteristics, and we'll say so-and-so is very courageous, or so-and-so is very creative, so-and-so is not very organized, as if those were somehow genetic. But in each case, they are virtues, they are habits, they are super habits that anybody can cultivate. And so you can see how if you grow in the virtue of orderliness, the super habit of orderliness, you'll be more productive. If you grow in the virtue of prudence or practical wisdom, which is the super habit of making wise decisions, you'll also be more productive. So there's this direct way in which growing in virtue makes people more productive. But there's also a more subtle, more indirect way that I think is in some ways even more powerful, and that's what I want to focus on. And this one goes in two steps. The first step is the recognition that people who grow in virtue become happier. We've known that for 3,500 years since Aristotle. But if you don't want to believe Aristotle and 3,500 years of philosophy, then you could look at modern psychology. You don't have to read this. This is just a partial listing of recent studies in psychology showing that as you grow in any of the virtues, you become happier, your well-being improves, right? So your happiness, your well-being improves as we grow in virtue. So that's the first step. That is, if we help employees grow in virtue, they will become happier. And then the second step, again, also it's sort of intuitively, we know this, especially those of us who run businesses, that happy employees are more productive. So greater well-being leads to greater productivity. So virtue leads to well-being leads to productivity. Again, you can believe this because it's intuitive, it makes sense, or maybe from your own observation. But now we actually have scientific research that proves this very soundly. A collaboration between some professors at Harvard and at Oxford did a very creative piece of research where they took a large number of observations from the website Indeed.com. This is a website where people go to post and get jobs. But while you're there, they require you to put ratings about the companies that you work for or have worked for. And in particular, the scholars took these 4 ratings that I list up here. They'll ask people to kind of on a scale of 1 to 7 type thing. I am happy at work most of the time. My work has a clear sense of purpose. Overall, I'm completely satisfied in my job. And then there's one that's sort of reverse coded. I feel stressed at work most of the time. That would be sort of a negative one. So you put those 4 together and you get a pretty good sense of whether people are happy at their company. So they took tens of thousands of these observations for 3,000 different companies. And then they matched them with the financial data from those 3,000 companies. They're all public companies, so they could get all of that data. And the results were really superb. And so here are some charts from that study. In terms of firm value, return on assets, and profits, a strong correlation between employees being happy and companies being more successful. So in terms of firm value, what they compared was it says company well-being, but they're talking about the well-being of the employees themselves, measured in terms of those 4 items I showed you. And the first one, for firm value, they used something called Tobin's Q. There's a bunch of finance people here. You know what that is. For the rest of us, it's basically a measure of market value of the company over book value, or specifically over the replacement value of the asset. So it just shows how much wealth is this firm creating, how much value is it creating. And you can see the chart. There's a strong correlation between employee happiness and firm value. Same for return on assets, not exactly as tight, but it's still a good correlation, and the same with profits. Now that's point-in-time correlation, and you could argue, yes, well, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe more profitable companies have happier employees, because they're going to have fewer layoffs, for example. But so they also did it staggered. So they took the happiness measure at a point in time, or the change in happiness at a point in time, and it was able to predict change in firm performance at a later point in time. So this seems to be a causal connection here. So really powerful stuff. So making employees happier, and then happier employees get you more productivity. So I hope I established a good kind of sense of the connection here. So then the question, of course, will be, how do we do this? How do we help employees grow in virtue, make them grow in well-being, and therefore into productivity as well? And the answer here, I'm going to rest on yet another, I think, very thorough study that just came out this summer, this May. And this is a study of what drives change in behavior. What are the biggest drivers of change in behavior? Now, if you follow social science studies, you know that, and we joke about, you can prove almost anything with statistics, right? If you tumble the numbers any way you like, right? So one of the most powerful scientific or social scientific approaches are to do what's called a meta-analysis, where you take a large number of studies on the same topic and you kind of average them all out. And that way, if there are any foolish studies in there, they kind of just get knocked out. And the preponderance of evidence then will show you kind of what's actually going on. So this was such a meta-analysis. There are over 300 studies of different attempts to change human behavior, to see what are the strongest drivers. And they tested things like skills, changes in beliefs, changes in knowledge, emotional appeals, changes in attitudes, and habits. By far, the strongest was habits. If you want to change people's behavior, you change their habits. There's been, over the last 10 years, a big kind of growth in the literature on habits, books called like Atomic Habits or The Power of Habits. Maybe you're familiar with them. So we knew something was going on when these books started to really take off, because they seem to be working for people. This provides the scientific evidence to show you why. It really does work. So if the slide is incomprehensible to you, it doesn't matter. The point is, habits good. Okay, that's the summary of this slide. So habits better than anything else. So we know that virtues are habits, right? Are super habits. So if we want to get our employees to become more virtuous, we help them cultivate these habits. So how do we help employees grow in super habits? Here I have a little app to help you. So some of you have tried this. We sent a link out to this. Thank you to those who have tried it. It's an app that basically helps you assess the state of your virtue. It tells you kind of where are you strong in virtues, where could you use some growth. And it's completely private. So I'm going to share some data shortly that's purely aggregate. I don't have access to it. So any of you who filled it out, don't worry. I have no idea what you scored on, and no one does. It's all private. This app comes from a startup called Superhabits LLC, and it was funded by Tim Connors. Some of you know him. He's a venture capitalist. Pivot North is his company, and he read my book. He read a pre-release version of it, and came to me and said, we should do an app, and I'll fund it. And so I run the Bush School of Business, and we teach our students when a venture capitalist comes to you and says, I'll give you money, you pay attention, right? Because they're very picky about who they give money to. So we then had to hire a coder to do all the development work for us. And at the Bush School, we are strong fans of family business. We have this thing called the Family Business Consortium, so we think family business is a very good idea. My son is a coder, and he's now CEO of this company. So he did all of the coding. He's also a graduate of Catholic U from a few years back and a serial entrepreneur. So this is kind of what he does. So that's a fun family business. So you use the app to evaluate yourself or to evaluate all of your employees or a division or a team, and then collectively see, okay, so where are the gaps? And if you wanted to see kind of for yourself, so this is representative somewhat of the people in the room. These are your top super habits according to your, again, this is aggregated for everybody who tried the app in the last few days. You'll be very happy to see that the highest scoring super habit was religion, so the virtue of religion. So in case you're worried, this is on a scale of 1 to 7, so not 10. Okay, so we're doing really well on religion. 6.7 out of 7, which is terrific. Reasoning, which is the habit of kind of logical thinking or critical thinking, doing very well. Teachability, sometimes called docility, the habit of learning well from others. It includes listening skills, for example. So doing very well on that. Patriotism, doing very well. Compliance is the habit of kind of taking orders, following rules, following the law. So this is clearly a very law-abiding group, no surprise. The virtue of gratitude is next. Creativity, doing quite well. Forgiveness as well. Respect. Magnanimity, from the Latin mania anima, big soul, is the habit, the super habit, the virtue of zestfully taking on big challenges. So the creation and execution of yesterday's procession is an act of magnanimity, right? It's just something, want to do something great, right? And then I was going to show you the top 10, but number 11 was honesty, so I thought I'd show you the top 11, so we know this is also a very honest group. Now you might say, wait a minute, these are self-evaluations. What if people lie about being honest? It's very interesting. People have done studies comparing self-evaluations on things like honesty with others' evaluations of them, including their boss's evaluations. And people are remarkably honest, even about being dishonest. Isn't that interesting? So you can actually find out how honest somebody is by asking them in an anonymous questionnaire. Yeah? So I think we can trust this data. How about, okay, now you want to see, okay, so where can we improve? I'll show you, these are from the bottom of the list. The good news is even those towards the bottom are still very high scores, relatively speaking. The middle would be 4. So even these lower scores are above average, so that's good. So orderliness is the habit, the super habit, the virtue of doing the right things in the right order. So it's being very organized. The virtue of contentment is being happy with the material goods that you have. Humility is not thinking little of yourself. It's the habit of having a correct understanding of who you are, what your ability is, what your abilities are. Correction, this is an interesting one. This is the habit of giving correction to others, particularly those under your authority, giving correction and giving punishment where necessary. So parents to children, supervisors to subordinates. I've seen it at the bottom of lists like this often because we're so uncomfortable criticizing other people. Yet correction is actually one of the virtues of justice. We owe this to people in justice. So when we don't give people correction that we owe them, and you can see this with children whose parents don't discipline them, right? They turn out to be awful. So we've done an injustice to the kids, right? Yeah. So now the last item on the list, you're probably going, huh? What is that? So eutropelia, that's a Greek word. The original Greek meaning is wittiness, but it has grown to extended to mean basically having good leisure, being able to relax, enjoy yourself, chill out a little bit, and you guys as New Yorkers, hardworking, ambitious New Yorkers, perhaps that's not a surprise. But the message here is that eutrapelia is a virtue. And so to not have it is a vice, a bad thing. Okay, so we'll say more about how to grow in eutrapelia in a moment. That'll be your homework. These are some of the virtues that make up a total of 50 virtues. Some of you have seen this graphic before. If it looks overwhelming, it's because it is. It takes a while to get used to, but when you do, people love it. This is a visualization of the treatise on virtue by St. Thomas Aquinas from the middle of the Summa Theologia. It's a couple of hundred pages boiled down to one graphic. So if it seems, I say a lot, it's because there's a lot of information in there. And what it does is it shows how beautifully Aquinas brings together all the virtues and shows how they fit all together. And the kind of three messages from St. Thomas. The first is that all of this covers all of human life, so that whatever challenge you're facing in life, doesn't matter, there is a virtue for that. There is a virtue that as you grow in that virtue, you will be able to fix that challenge, or at least deal with that challenge more effectively. And the way he works it is as follows. You start in the center of the diagram where it says human life. So 360 degrees, that represents a whole human life. And then each ring, as you move outwards, is a further distinction within human life. So the first ring, the gold one, is the distinction between supernatural and natural, spiritual and material. And so for the spiritual life, we have the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, which the bishop mentioned before. So those are on the outside. You can see it up there at the sort of 10 o'clock to noon on the cycle there. Then you take material life, St. Thomas does, and then you distinguish between the intellectual and the practical sides of life. So the intellectual side has its own virtues as well. So those are in gray at the sort of 9 o'clock and upwards. And then most of this is I focus on the practical life. And so for the practical life, St. Thomas divides into our thoughts, our actions, and our feelings. So fairly comprehensive. You think about everyday life. Is there anything you experience other than thoughts, actions, feelings? Pretty comprehensive. And then he takes the feelings and makes a further distinction between feelings for or desires and feelings against, which would be fears. Now, the usual translations of Thomas talk about intellect, will, and passions, irascible and concupiscible passions. I don't do that because, A, I'm not a philosopher, and B, most people don't follow me when I do that. So I try to speak English the way everyone else does. And so these, I think, are reasonably good translations. But here's the second big insight from St. Thomas. So thoughts, actions, and the two kinds of feelings, fears and desires. How many of us have heard of the four cardinal virtues? Prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, right? Everybody. Good. So prudence, or practical wisdom, the super habit of making wise decisions, that's what governs our thoughts in our day-to-day life, right? Because mostly we're thinking in our day-to-day life for making decisions. Justice, the super habit of treating everybody fairly and respecting their human dignity, is what governs our actions, because we're supposed to act justly always. Fortitude, or courage, the super habit of moving ahead even though you might be afraid, is what governs our fears, helps us deal with our fears. And then temperance, or self-discipline, the super habit of only giving into your desires when they make sense to do so, is what governs our desires. So those four cardinal virtues, if you ever wondered why these four, it's because they cover together every aspect of daily life, thoughts, actions, feelings. Isn't that powerful? And St. Thomas explains this in the Summa. I wondered for a long time, why those four? Oh, because the ancients said so. But why did the ancients say so? Well, St. Thomas explains it, because they cover every aspect of life. The last thing that St. Thomas, I really want to highlight from this, is that he then notices that those four cardinal virtues each have a whole bunch of associated virtues, allied virtues, he calls them. So there are four for courage, for example. There are 15 different allied virtues for self-discipline, for temperance. And the significance of this, I hammered this hard at the Napa speech this summer, is that if you're trying to grow in self-discipline and finding it difficult, it's because it is difficult. because you're trying to grow effectively in 15 different virtues at once. And that's just tough. So what's better is pick one of those 15. Restraint or humility, diligence, these are all types of self-discipline, and just focus on that one for now. And as you grow, that will strengthen you in self-discipline overall. It's a very, very practical thing, very practical thing. I'm not going to say much more about this wheel because that's a whole sort of hour-long presentation on its own, but I will point out first that thank you to the CIC. So Mitch is here, and Emma and Angelica. They brought a free copy of this book for each and every one of you. So please take it. If you don't take it, I'll be really offended. If you won't even take it for free, you know. It's like, so yes, everybody get a copy. And don't do this now if you have your copy, but in the back, nice surprise, suitable for framing, every copy of the book, courtesy of Sophia Press, comes with a copy of the diagram. Okay, so don't pull it out now because you'll get distracted. But anyway, so that's with every book. And as you read through the book, you can follow on the diagram. And if you do like we did, you stick it on your fridge and you point it to your children every day. Okay, so those are the different virtues. And we're talking about how do we get our employees to grow in those virtues. And the answer is pick a small number. Pick a small number of them and focus on them. How do we do that? My suggestion is you do, so this is illustrative. This is not now any longer with the data from this group. What you do is you rate each of the virtues, or you highlight which of the virtues are most important, and then you compare them to how well we're doing, how well the employees are doing on those virtues. So on the vertical axis of this would be the importance of each of the virtues, and the horizontal would be 1 to 7, how are we doing? Now you measure importance, it's your own assessment, subjective assessment, but it would be driven by what are we trying to achieve as an organization? Are we trying to cut costs, for example, in which case we might say we're thrift. The virtue, the super habit of being frugal would be a really good virtue to teach to our employees. Or if we're trying to grow customer service, for example, then friendship or friendliness would be a really good virtue to help them grow in. And so you think through kind of what's our strategy, what are our goals. You could also think in terms of what are our values. So values, virtues, very different, right? Values is what's important to us. Virtues are we in the habit of living in ways that kind of bring those values alive. So we figure out what our values are and then choose the virtues that would contribute to those values. And then, so if you did that, and say in this illustrative case, you look to the top left of the diagram, of the chart, to tell you, okay, these are the things that are going to be most important, and simultaneously that your employees are weakest on. So if we look at the chart, we'd say, for example, at the top there, judgment, friendliness, humility, diligence. Those would all be virtues that we should consider making a priority if this was our own data. I say this is just illustrative here. Each company, each organization, each team or work unit is going to have a different configuration because it depends on your priorities and the state of the employees themselves. Sorry, I forgot to mention one quick thing here. There was a second column on each of these, the standard deviation. That tells you how much variation was there around each of these virtues. And that's very important, very interesting, particularly on the ones where we're strong here. It tends to be fairly narrow. How to read this is, so the religion one is 0.5. What it means is plus or minus that number is 2/3 of the respondents to the survey. So 2/3 of the people are within plus and minus 0.5 of the 6.7 on religion. Now, obviously, it can't go higher than 7, but you get the idea. So, and what we find is with working groups, you tend to have this narrow, or groups that are similar or work together, you tend to have this narrow standard deviation because virtue is contagious. So people who work together tend to have similar virtues and similar vices because they kind of get them from each other. And so you kind of get them to work together. So, okay, so let's say we've highlighted 1, 2, 3 virtues that we want to get our employees to get better at. How do we do that? And so then the next step is to talk about how do you grow from a vice to a virtue. And the ancients taught us that you don't jump from a vice or a bad habit to a virtue. You don't jump from the absence of a virtue to a virtue kind of instantly. There are intermediate steps that you have to go through. And the names of those intermediate steps, unfortunately, are incontinence and continence. So what they mean by that is, you have a vice, and when you have a vice or a bad habit, you're typically oblivious to the lack in your soul, right? So let's give the example of generosity. If you are the stingiest miser, you're not aware that there is such a thing as generosity or that it matters. The next step up is what is classically called incontinence, where you become aware that generosity matters and you try to be generous, but you generally fail. You struggle, but the old habit is so strong that you don't really succeed. But if you keep struggling, and with the help of grace, you then become continent, which means you're now succeeding. You struggle and you are generous, but you still have to struggle to do that. You still feel like you're pushing against the grain. You're giving away money, but it's like uncomfortable. It's not true virtue until it becomes habit, right? Fully habit, fully part of you, so that you're not really struggling anymore. And this is a really, really great message, especially when I share this with our young people, the students at the Bush School. Growing up and being good at things can seem intimidating to them. It's like, so much I have to learn, so much I have to take on, all this feedback I have to absorb. When they realize that they can grow in virtue, that it actually becomes easy, that this actually becomes easier to be good, to do good, to be effective, it's a really good news, because now it becomes part of me and it's effortless. The mark of reaching true virtue is you do the thing that the virtue is having you do happily, promptly, and easily. Right? Who would like to go through life doing all the right stuff, happily, promptly, easily? All of us, right? So this is the path to it. Now, I say unfortunately because the words incontinence and continence have come to have a very different meaning. And so I don't think we want to round our businesses talking about continence and incontinence. So I use a different set of terms. These are terms familiar in the training business that I think are very descriptive and match beautifully to the concepts here. So you start out when you have kind of very little or no virtue in a particular place with unconscious incompetence. You're not good at this thing and you don't even know it. The next step is conscious incompetence. You become aware of the lack. You struggle, but you're still not very good at it. Then we get to conscious competence, so you're aware of it, and you're successful, but it's a struggle. And then the ultimate virtue is when you have unconscious competence. So you do this almost without thinking, almost without effort. That becomes, we say, second nature becomes part of you. You hardly have to think about it. You're generous. It doesn't even hurt anymore to give away. And unfortunately, modern ethics makes you feel like if it doesn't hurt, it's no longer good. And that's complete nonsense, right? The most generous people don't feel any pain when they give away money. That's the mark of true generosity. It's so much part of you that you have joy in doing it, which is great news, isn't it? Because it takes away so many struggle areas from our lives. Okay, so to just kind of give you on one page, what are we doing when we're trying to help our employees grow in virtue? So step one is figure out what specific business improvement are we targeting and how will we measure it? Very important. We want to measure this to know that it's working. Second, identify the relevant super habits so that we'll know what are the habits we're going to help our employees grow in. Third is help them find ways to practice the relevant super habits, measure the results, refine and repeat. We want to make this a kind of a continuous improvement process. I'll just say a little more on number 3, which is how to help employees identify ways to grow in particular super habits. On the left side, I've got 3 examples, and there are many studies on how to grow in the different virtues that have sort of validated or proven approaches. A really simple one, say, for the virtue of orderliness, the super habit of doing the right things at the right time, is a daily to-do list. Really good habit. Get everybody in the organization, team, or whatever, to every morning write down a prioritized list of what you're going to do, and then check off things as you go through. First few days they complain, I have to do this, then it becomes a habit, and you watch productivity just soar. Humility, really good technique for growing in humility. Every time you have to make a decision, write down everything you don't know about the context of that decision. Really helps you kind of get an accurate sense of, okay, well, I guess I know less than I thought, or maybe I know more than I thought. But again, proven to help people grow in humility. Eutrapelia, which you all need apparently, spend minimum 3 hours a week doing something that you enjoy doing for its own sake. Or maybe even just do it kind of half an hour each day. And it truly has to be something for its own sake. Because we go to the gym to work out to be healthier and look better. And we socialize to network. And we read to improve our minds. Like, there's got to be something that you do just for its own sake. St. Thomas, writing about eutropelia in the Summa, says, enjoyment is rest for the soul. If you think about it, if our bodies are tired, then all we have to do is stop moving to rest. Lie down, sit down, and we rest. But if our soul, our minds are tired, how do you stop your mind from ticking over? Even when we're sleeping, our minds are, dreaming and whatever, sorting. The only time when our minds and our souls are at rest is when we are enjoying ourselves. Because our minds are sort of goal-seeking organisms. And so they're always trying to get us to do stuff. But if you're playing a game or playing music or just having fun conversation with friends, the mind stops trying to achieve things just for the fun of it. And that's when we truly are at rest. So this is not me, this is St. Thomas Aquinas. So. But then the app can also help you. Those of you who have tried it, you know this, because there's no way you won't know it, because it keeps texting you, saying, so, you're going to practice your virtue today? And then at the end of the day, it says, so, how did it go? And you can converse with it. It's an AI coach, and you can say, I didn't do so well. Why not? Okay, and then you tell it why, and then it helps you modify the practice, give you some hacks for remembering tomorrow, and whenever you do it, it will mark it up for you, so then it'll tell you how long your streak is going, and it's very positive, very cheerful, and relentless. Those of you who have tried it. We are actually working on it so that it could give you a break. Like if you ignore it for 2 or 3 days, that it would go away for a while. But right now, it just keeps coming at you. But it's highly effective. Getting some really good anecdotal feedback. Tom Monahan is here. We were doing this last week with a group of legates, and one of them said to me, he was here yesterday at the procession as well. He said, I was trying to improve the sort of teachability, listening skills. So my practice was spend 5 minutes a day listening. Keep my mouth shut for like 5 minutes and listen to someone. So he said, so I was doing that with my wife, and she was talking, and then she stopped talking, and only 2 minutes had passed. So I said to her, do you have anything more to say? And she goes, yeah. And she carried on talking, and then she stopped and she said, is something wrong with you? She said, 30 years we've been married, and you've never asked me, do I have anything else to say? So he gives credit to the app, So I'm just saying, this is good stuff. An app that helps you grow in virtue. Okay, let me summarize. So virtues, super habits, can drive productivity directly because there's certain virtues that, I say, like orderliness, practical wisdom, and so on, that will help you be more productive directly, but then also indirectly, because all virtues make us happier, give us better well-being, which in turn then also leads to productivity. So, quick takeaways. Read the book. So you all got a free copy. Read it. Share it with your team. Use the Superhabits app to become happier and more productive. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I prefer LinkedIn to all the social media because there's the least fighting going on over there. I think it's constructive, and I know several of you I follow as well. But I'm trying to make it a place to kind of talk about the super habits, share ideas, and so on. So do connect with me. As I wrap up, I want to point out just a couple of things about where. So this book took me about 1.5 years to write, but it's really stuff I've been thinking about, I would say, for the last 20 years and more. And so I just want to share, because a couple of people who've been very significant in this project are in this room. I mentioned Tom. Tom is sitting right here, Tom Monahan. His book, his autobiography, Pizza Tiger, I highly recommend. I read this 20 years ago, I think, and around when it came out. No, it's a bit after it came out. Yeah. So yeah, a bit after it came out. Yeah. I read it, and as I'm reading through, I'm noticing all these, I call them habits. I don't think Tom didn't refer to them as habits, but these practices that Tom had that were clearly key to his effectiveness and his success. And I remember thinking, if I could like somehow bottle these or capture them and then share them with my students, And then I'm a fan of reading business biographies, and I started to notice that in many different business biographies, that different ways of doing things. And I thought, could we have some kind of way to categorize these? And then it became evident we're talking about virtues, right? These are the different virtues that different business people exhibit. Then in conversation with Tim Bush, Tim was talking about how new employees, especially young employees that he hires for his hotels, oftentimes for them it's the first time in their lives that somebody's expecting them to show up on time, properly dressed, communicate clearly. In other words, they're also learning habits that become virtues through the practice of business. Peter Forlenza, who will be up on the panel, will share a case with you as well, where we talk about virtue. This one hasn't been written in a book yet, but I want to write that book. So listen up to that one. But so I wanted to just highlight, because a book like this never comes from nowhere. Especially in my case, I have the privilege of being the dean of the Bush School of Business. I get to meet with so many great business leaders, and all of those conversations. Be careful what you tell me, because it'll show up in my next book. So it just really helps kind of fuel this. But why I think this is important, why I wrote the book, why we're doing this at the Bush School, other than the fact that it really works to help people get better and happier and healthier, is that virtue was at the heart of all classical civilizations. Kind of almost every great civilization in history that achieved anything was grounded in virtue. We don't seem to have that very much anymore. And that's because the institutions that used to pass on virtue are all themselves in trouble. So the family was the first school of virtue. You know what problems we have with families, so many broken families, so many fewer people actually getting married and so on. Churches also used to be a place for cultivation of passing on the virtue tradition, fewer and fewer people going to church. Schools, 90+% of children are educated in public school. Not much happening with virtue in public school, Not even in many private schools, although there are some good Catholic schools that focus on character education, which means virtue education. So who's going to do it? I think business can, because there's a business case for doing it. It's good for business to help your employees grow in virtue. Unless you think, that's so instrumental, it can't really be virtue. Not true. It turns out that when people grow in virtue for instrumental reasons, then they tend to fall in love with virtue. They like being that way. So you take away the instrumentality, they remain virtuous. So it truly does work. So I think virtue can be an instrument for generating a renewal of virtue in this country. So that's what we're trying to do at the Bush School. That's what we're trying to do with the Superhabits work. So join us. I think this is important. Thank you very much. I think, but I could be wrong, we have time for questions, or did I go over time? Great. So if have any questions, happy to.
Dr. Andrew, can you hear me? Hey.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk, and congrats on the book. I benefited a lot from Atomic Habits. I'm excited to read yours. I don't mean to go off theme here, but since a lot of us are parents, I'm curious how you would advise us to implement this with our children. I have a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old, so maybe a little bit of an anomaly there, but how do we do that with our children?
With the 4-month-old, I think you can wait a little bit. So, but I like your enthusiasm. What I have found most helpful, and I would say our eldest is 27, our youngest is 15, so I came to this a little late. But what I found most helpful is once you know what the virtues are, what the complete set of virtues are, it helps you diagnose kind of behavioral issues. It's like, this is a lack of friendliness here, or lack of orderliness. And then having diagnosed that, then what you want to do is encourage them in the behaviors. Because growing in virtue is very much a fake it till you make it. You act it out, and then it becomes part of you. So you get them to. So that's why you say, bribe them with candy. It's like, is that bad? Well, if you can get them into the behavior, I'm not saying just overload them with candy, but encouragement and rewards and punishments as necessary, so long as you get them acting out the behaviors of the virtue, then it becomes a habit. I didn't talk about the sort of neurological side of this. The physical manifestation of a habit is a neurological pathway in your brain. And the way those pathways are created is just by going through the behavior repeatedly. So you want to get them to behave in the right ways, and then the virtue follows. That would be my suggestion, although I'm not an expert in child education or formation, so there are probably others who could speak better, particularly with children. So I tend to focus on them when they're 17 or 18 onwards, because that's when they come to college. So.
Thank you, Dr. Abela. How would you respond to the question of how the utility of virtue and how seeking that as an end result of virtue could misshape the integrity of seeking virtue for excellence's sake?
Yeah, so it is a question that comes up a lot. And I sort of touched on it a little bit before, the notion that virtue is its own reward. And to try to be instrumental in our use of virtue somehow undermines virtue is the biggest lie that prevents us from growing in virtue. Because virtue is very practical. It has really good results. As I say, it makes life easier, more effective, happier, and healthier. I'll say a word about the healthier. Studies on gratitude show that when people grow in gratitude by keeping a virtue diary, is a good way to grow in gratitude, they get improvements in both mental and physical health. They see reductions in anxiety, reductions in depression, and reductions in chronic pain. So if you have a bad back and you keep a gratitude diary and you start to become more grateful, does that somehow weaken your gratitude? No. So the practicality is a really good side of it. And the key thing, as I say, is the more you practice it, the more you grow in the virtue, you then get to love the virtue itself. And the scaffolding falls away. The practical reason, it doesn't matter anymore that you're doing it because you had a bad back. Even if you stop having a bad back, I'm speaking from experience. I had a bad back and I started a gratitude diary. My back is fine. I even bring the gratitude diary with me when I travel. I just love doing that. So I think that's it. People will raise that issue and they're wrong.
Good morning. Does your book address possible hiring, the way you hire, like a questionnaire, or how to hire virtuous, how to seek out virtuous new employees?
Not directly. Although I could see how behavioral interviewing is very effective. You could structure behavioral interviewing questions that would elicit kind of virtues or lack thereof. I prefer to focus though more on the employees we have and helping them grow in virtue. That's kind of more the focus. But I think it could work in the hiring as well. Identify, and I've heard of many companies that try to hire virtuous employees. It makes a lot of sense. I should say the book, even though I'm drawing in from positive psychology, I'm drawing in from philosophy, the book itself is written with a bunch of stories. So the nicest comment or quote I got on the book was, "This is a work of deep philosophy masquerading as a self-help book," which I thought was a double compliment. But I think it does read as a self-help book. It's a quick and easy read, fun read, entertaining, while kind of teaching a bunch of points about virtue.
Thank you, Dr. Abela. Sorry, over here.
No, thank you.
You touched on this briefly with respect to parenting, but in the context of business, what is the relationship in your mind between creating effective incentive structures and the actual inculcating of virtues and habits with inside employees?
It's a really good point. If the incentives are designed to support the creation of habits, then it's likely they're going to work, but the mechanism is going to be the habits, not the incentives. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like you're using the incentives to form the habits. If you're just relying on the incentives, it's never going to be very effective. So you have to think about what am I incenting, and what I should be incentivizing is some particular virtue that I'm trying to encourage in my employees. But I wouldn't do it through incentives alone. I would teach them about, the concept of super habits or virtue, show them what they're like. You can even kind of watch movies, read stories, and so on, just to kind of expand their vision of what it's like to be human, and then talk about specific practices they would do, and then you add on the incentives as well. And the whole package is what's going to drive the behavior change.
Is this on? Okay. You talked about how all of these virtues will lead. Oh, I'm over here.
Thank you. I
stand up.
It's like a disembodied voice. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
You talked about how all these virtues, people who are more virtuous are more happy, and then talked about how this reads like a self-help book, and that kind of goes together. I've heard a lot of talks about how the faith is kind of the opposite of that, how it should be that you do what's right in spite of the happiness, and there's a lot of suffering potentially in doing what's right, in having virtue. What would you say to people who don't have that outcome of the better life, happiness, or whatever it is, because of you adopted these virtues?
So that's a rich and deep question. If I don't think you're saying this, but if someone was saying, as you grow in faith, you're going to suffer more, and that's the most important thing to know, then you're just messed up. That's not how we think about it, right? That's this morning at Mass, Archbishop was talking about Jansenism, I think it is. It sounds awfully like that, just like, suck it in, Rob Neal told me a funny joke. He said, people say of the Catholic faith, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was no. It's like, what a drag, It's like, especially for our young people, it is the case that as we grow in faith, we become more joyful. As we get closer to God, we become happier. And if there is suffering, it is joyful suffering, because we're doing it for Him, right? I think this is really important, right? Yes, the bishop is nodding. So maybe I witness, right? So yeah. No, it's really dangerous to pass on this idea that, it's just going to be so hard, because that's what scares the young people away. Who wants that, The joy is what we're looking for here. And then you say, well, you're just Catholic because you're being more joyful. It's like, stop making nonsense, It's just like, it's all together. Like, we live for Him, and when we live for Him, our lives overflow in joy. Now, bad things can happen, right? Bad things do happen. We can get sick. We can get chronic diseases. We can be in the middle of a war. Who knows? All kinds of horrible stuff. The good news is, growing in faith and growing in virtue is always the right thing to do. That you could be in a concentration camp, and trying to grow in virtue would be the best move living in that concentration camp. Okay? Does that make sense? I hope I didn't misinterpret your question. Thank you. Okay, good. Yes, Grady.
Thank you, Doctor. Great talk. I can imagine going back to my team, and their first question is, what's the difference between a virtue and a value? We spend a lot of time talking about company core values, this and that. Can you help me to explain the distinction? Absolutely.
And because they both begin with V, people often conflate them. In fact, when I first started talking about virtues, people would say, oh yeah, we have corporate values. No, I didn't say values. So values, here's a clean way to explain it. Values are talking the talk. Virtue is walking the walk. Boom, right? Tim Gray, many of you know, president of Augustine Institute, the way he put it to me was, he said, value is like, I value aviation safety. Good, we all do. Virtue, he said, virtue is knowing how to fly the plane. Powerful, right? It's taking your values and turning them into habits. Because we know people who act against their values. Often, we see it, right? You wish, you value certain things, but you don't live in accordance with them, just because we are weak, right? But it's very, very unlikely that somebody would act against a habit, because habit is very powerful, as I mentioned from that research before. So that's the big difference. Talking the talk, walking the walk. One more, if there is one more.
Sorry.
Yes, Peter.
Fantastic talk, inspiring. I wish I'd met you many years ago, because you would have stopped a lot of sticks in my eyes. But I'll be speaking later on this afternoon. But one of the things that you bring up is this concept of coaching CEOs, leaders of companies, to do this, right? Because it starts at the head. It's about leadership.
Yeah.
The biggest struggle we found in our organization, which is coaching CEOs to do this, is the fear that they have of, I'm not perfect. And when I'm afraid of not being perfect, how do I stand up and say, company, we got to have these amazing values when I myself am flawed? And they get stuck. And they don't want to stand up a pedestal and talk about values and virtues and all these things. Because in those moments of crisis when we're CEOs, we're faced with some tough decisions. And we don't always act appropriately. And so how do you encourage a CEO to step out of that fear zone to say, I can be an example, even though I'm not perfect? Because none of us are perfect, right? But we almost feel like we have to be perfect to do these super habits. So
it's a great question, Peter. Thank you. I give you one answer that I don't like, and then an answer that I hope is a little bit better. The answer that I don't like is people talk about being vulnerable. Let's be more vulnerable. I don't like vulnerability is not a virtue. What it is it's a compound of virtues, somewhat, including courage, because it takes courage to disclose things about yourself, honesty, because you are disclosing, and humility, right? So those are three virtues that are worth growing in. I prefer the virtues, I say, because vulnerability, it is possible to be too vulnerable, right? And you don't want CEOs going around, and you lose everybody's confidence, right, at that point. So that's the trick for a CEO. You still try to maintain confidence. Practically speaking, the story about super habits is not we have to be all perfect, but here's a great opportunity for all of us to live better, happier, more effective lives. And we're all on a journey trying to grow, and every one of us, the app will give, when you do your assessment, will give you green, yellow, and red, depending on where you stand. We all have stuff in the red, and I think as CEO, disclosing one or two of those would be helpful, Now, judiciously, like, I have trouble making decisions. I'm your CEO. No, you probably shouldn't be our CEO, right, at that point. But I mean, so I say we all have some virtues that we're trying to grow in. But the really good news story is these virtues are not optional tools that you can add to a toolkit. We all have them all at some level. The analogy might be like the wheels on a bus. We're all buses with 50 wheels, right? These 50 virtues. It's just that some of those tires need a bit of inflating, and some of them may be completely flat. Maybe a more organic analogy would be muscles, right? You've ever played a new sport or did something and you go, oh, muscles I didn't even know I had. They hurt, That's the same thing with virtues. These are all muscles, spiritual, psychological muscles that everybody has. We get them all in baptism, right? We have them all. It's just that we need to exercise them to make them work. And so we all have neglected some of them, either just by chance or by who knows. And so by sharing that kind of optimistic view, I think, with the employees and saying, look, this is a journey for all of us. We all need to get better at thrift or whatever the thing you pick, and we're all going to do this together. And the app even allows you to share updates with a limited set of friends or your team or however, just all voluntary. It's actually that's a development that we hope to release in the next couple of weeks, where you would say, okay, because you do the survey every couple of weeks just to see how you're doing, or as often as you want, and you say, okay, I went up in this, and I'm really embarrassed to say I did mine, and I went down 0.2 in humility. Darn. So that was humbling. Yeah? So maybe I'll go back up again. So who knows? So just be disclosing some of that, I think, can help with that. So very good. All right. Thank you.